All right, I think we're live, but it's just taken. There we go. I was just saying, I think we're live, but the chat was just taking a moment to get started. But I want everybody to know that I am here with my. Oh, hold on. I'm echoing. Echo, echo. Stop. Okay, come on. Okay, I think I fixed the problem. Okay, all right, I was echoing, but now we are here. We are live, and I will get rid of this thumbnail so that everybody can see us. And I've got, oh great, now this window has changed. Somehow this is I don't know how this works, but anyway, here we are. We've got Gary Wayne, and we've got NPC 3.14 with me. But say hello, Gary Wayne. Hi, nice to have you here. I know. I oh, hold on. It is a normal thing for you, and then yeah. So what Gary just said, sorry, I had the volume either muted or down. That he's glad that he's okay that there's a problem once in a while because it does seem to happen every time. But you know what, Gary? The great thing is I got new, faster internet, and so I don't think we'll have any problems with glitches there. So I'm excited about that.
I was impressed with the quality of the picture of you compared to the last time we did a video.
Yes.
It's
better.
Significant. Yeah.
Hey Aaron, they said Gary is muted.
He's not anymore. He was for just a
pardon.
second, and it was just during that part where he said it's okay because it seems like every time he comes on, there's some kind of hiccup or glitch, and we're all getting used to it. Anyway, you're not going to see video of NPC because he is incognito, but Gary, thank you for being here. And you said last time we were going to start into Nephilim Wars Part 2, and looking at the chapter, Gary, we talked a lot about the battles with Joshua, and then it kind of leads into and up until the time of King David, it even says on page 233. Is that a good place to start tonight?
Yeah, I think so. And but I don't really do a lot of talking about the Nephilim Wars after that chapter. So I mean, I will when we get into the book, when we get into the time of David and Saul. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I won't really get into a ton of detail in there. I mean, you could do a book on just the giant wars, and I do a quick summary on a 14-part series of commentaries that people can get a hold of me if they want that through the email, and I'll send that to you. So, yeah, I think we were almost pretty much through the Joshua conquest of the Promised Land, and I thought I should probably do it's kind of a quick recap because some of the people may not have been listening the last time, and we'll move forward into beyond the time of Joshua, and we'll talk, hopefully we'll have time to talk about what are the implications of what this means, and how does it affect how we understand history and prehistory, and how does it affect prophecy. Because if you don't, one of the things that I always try and convey to people is that if you don't understand prehistory, then you're likely not going to get the full meaning of prophecy or the history that Israel went through, or what happened in Genesis, or what the implications for when Jesus came. If you don't get the understanding of some of the most significant events of the prehistory, then what happens after, you don't get the full meaning. And so that's why I think you need to understand prehistory to understand prophecy and history in general. So in the first show, and I won't go through all of the details because there's a lot of details, but we talked about kind of a few different campaigns of the war. And the first campaign, and we also talked about Genesis 14, which happens before the conquest in the time of Abraham. We also talked about the Mesopotamian kings and how those were Nephilim kings or Rephaim kings. And then most of the countries and the kings that were in that battle in Genesis 14 were also Rephaim kings, whether or not it was the kings of the Canaanites, or it was the Amorites, or it was the Horites, and also I think you have the kings of Ham as well, of the Zuzim. So you've got all of these different names that are involved in Genesis 14. And this is one of the major battles shortly after the flood in the time of Abraham. So let's say, 400 years or so, just as a circa date after the flood. And you have this massive east and west alliance of giant kingdoms that are waging this huge war. And many of these nations show up in the time of the conquest. So if you go to Deuteronomy 2, for example, it's going to list all of these giant names, and a lot of those are listed in that Genesis 14 war. And the hybrid nations, those families of Canaanite nations that don't have patriarchs, ones that were probably patriarched by Rephaim and from the daughters of either Heth, Sidon, or Canaan, they form the hybrid Rephaim giants, which are fighting alongside the Rephaim kings, and they are the Amorites, right? They are the Amalekites, but don't get confused with the Amalekites or the Malachim of Genesis 14, because they're predated. So there's a hybrid branch of Amalekim from Esau and not Esau, but through the Esau line, through Eliphaz and Timnah, who's a Horim who produces Amalek, where that nation comes from, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. So anyways, we talked about all of that. And then at the time of the Exodus, this was the first portion, is you have the spies going into Canaan, and they're seeing the three Rephaim kings, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, along with the hybrids, the ones that are just taller than Israel. But these are Anakim, and we're told in Deuteronomy 2 that the Anak or the Anakim or the Anakites, depending on which suffix that you're using on that, these were also Rephaim. And so you have both that are there. And then Deuteronomy 1 confirms all of the legitimate details of Numbers 13 with the spy report or the scouting report, except for the exaggeration with the Nephilim, because the Anakim are Rephaim. And that was just to scare the people. And that's the first battle, is with the Amalekites. We talked about how they were wanting to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And they wanted to do that so they could usurp the Messianic blessings and promises, the birthrights and the blessings that Jacob received instead of Esau. And so by law, they would have asserted, whether or not God would have permitted it, but by law in terms of how those rights came down, if Jacob wasn't, that nation wasn't there, it would have to go to Esau's nations, and they would have been promoting their dragon Messiah through that. But then you go through the 40 years in the desert, and when they come out, where Deuteronomy 1 starts, that's why you have that recap and reminding the Israelites that there's giants there and people taller and high-walled cities, the Hazarim fortresses. Then they go back up to where the spies were, and they have the Battle of Athranim, whereas Rephidim was the Battle of the Amalekim. They go back up to where the spies went in, and they have their first battle. And that's fighting with the kings of southern part of the covenant land. And then after that, they move around and go into what I call the Eastern Campaign. And that's when they took on Og and Sihon and the 5 Midian kings and their Pentapolis city-states, and understand that the Rephaim have these Pentapolis city-states as fortress defensive networks within their kingdoms, and it's a standard as you go through and read about the giant wars, whether or not it's the Philistine Pentapolis or the Pentapolis of all the various Canaanite kingdoms and Jebusite kingdoms and Gibeonite kingdoms and on and on and on. These are all set up in the same way with Pentapolis cities. And of course, King Og is ruling in Bashan, which is in Mount Hermon. And I probably didn't mention this in the first show, but it's interesting that Mount Hermon, which is thought to be the place where giants were created before the flood, possibly another place after the flood, on a second recreation, and or in Sodom, which is also part of that Genesis 14 war with the kings of Sodom and that Pentapolis city-states as well. But it's also called a few other names like Senir, but the one that I like to focus on is it's called Mount Sion, S-I-O-N. But that's not Zion. That comes out of another word out of Hebrew than this word. And Sion is that interesting transliteration of Zion into French as well. And that'll have a lot to do with secret societies and the priory of Sion and the crowning of the king of Jerusalem in that bloodline, which I'm jumping way ahead. But I just wanted to throw that out, that there's an interesting double entendre that's used there. That the secret societies and the bloodlines like to overlay as they will make their claim for Jerusalem and putting up their dragon Messiah. And so that is an interesting, set of wars in itself. And Og is the last of the Rephaim, but not of all of the Rephaim, but of the first generation. So when you read that 3 times, whether or not it's in Deuteronomy or in Joshua, that he's the last of the giants, he's not. He's the last of the second incursion.
Carry on. I can still hear you, but I apparently locked my child outside. I'm sorry.
No worries. And then after that,
yes,
Joshua and Moses dies. Joshua leads the Israelites across the Jordan. And then that's when they're going to be attacking numerous amount of Pentapolis cities that are in what I would call the central campaign. And that's not only going to include, cities like Jerusalem. I'm trying to think of the first one. Starts with Jericho.
Yeah.
I believe I forgot that one, right?
Sometimes it's the simplest things that I forget. It's so easy to like, how do I do that? But it happens.
Yeah. All I could see in my mind was Jane. None of the rest was coming for some reason.
But it did, thank goodness.
And they're taking on many Pentapolis cities. And there's also a bit of a rebellion with the Gibeonites, which are actually Havim and will become temple servants and make a peace treaty with Joshua. But that's the central campaign. And they're starting to run into what they're calling the mighty ones. And as you take those words back, as we talked about in the last show, it goes back to bone crushers. These giants were so big and powerful, they could crush bones with their hands. And not only that, they had iron weapons, they had chariots, they had all the high-tech military. This is a ragtag group of slaves 1 generation before, no manufacturing facilities that's stationary, probably fighting with just slings and bows and bronze sort of weapons and shields against monsters way bigger than them, and without the same type of weaponry. And without the help of God, there's no way they could have taken on these giants. Then after the central campaign,
real quick, somebody said, is that the Moabites, the Gibeon, or the mighty ones? Which one? What were they? Were they just called the mighty ones, or what were they called?
Yeah, I mean, when you read the mighty 7 nations that they're going to go up against, that word mighty, as I recall, I'm trying to think of the Hebrew word, and I think it's aretz, which is, and you go into a series of words, and that's the word you want to plug in.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yes. Yep.
Okay, just in case I wasn't clear enough on that. So, and then you have the southern campaign. And that's going to include those nations that I talked about, that whether or not they're Perizzites or the Amorites or the Jebusites or the Girgashites, all these different names. And after that, they're going to march north and do the northern campaign against King Hazor and his alliance of kings that will even include alliance of kings that are across the Jordan River and towards Mount Hermon and the Hazorim. And after that, I mean, that's probably the greatest battle in history, with the number of kings and armies that Joshua took on that nobody ever talks about. And then after that, he does the mountain campaign, because a lot of the giants have escaped into the mountain areas, particularly in the south, to hide. And he moves in and takes those on. And all of this takes the rest of Joshua's life. But he hasn't conquered the southern state of the Philistines, who live in the Gaza region, and those are the Seranim. And the Seranim and that's the lords and princes, as you take those words back to Hebrew. And that's not a Hebrew word, and that has an etymology and a relationship that goes back to the Gyges, or the giants of Greek heroes. And King Gyges, where the word giant comes from. And so the Philistines are made up of people that are not necessarily from that region, right? So you have some of the Avim that are still there, and it's actually the Philistines that are going to move in to and expropriate the land, conquer the Avim, and then live with them. So you're going to get the Philistines, which are probably a hybrid race, because they come down through the Table of Nations. But you also have other nations that are going to come with them. And these are the Caphtorites and the Cherethites, and all of those names that are associated coming out of the Table of Nations. They come from the island of Crete with the Philistines. And these are all giants. We have this another new mix of giants that are moving in. And this is the most powerful pentapolis of all, and probably why the Israelites didn't take them on at the beginning. And so as we enter into, the time of the judges, you have these people that are still there, and also including the Calushites. I missed that as we're talking about these types of peoples. And the Philistine pentapolis is going to be attacking the Israelites all through the times of the judges. And God is going to raise up certain judges to save Israel. So Israel is backsliding, and the Philistines are taking advantage of the Israelites for their backsliding away from God. So you're going to have Shamgar, you're going to have Samuel, you're going to have Samson, and eventually you're going to have King Saul, that the people are going to ask for a king. And it's interesting that they're going to ask for a king by the name of Saul, as he shows up in the Bible with his name, which is probably more of a title. But Saul is a full head and probably a neck taller than all the other Israelites.
Right.
And they chose a king that was a Nephilim, let's say, light, compared to what the Israelites were. And they wanted a king like the other nations. And I think that had a lot to do. They wanted a warrior king that would stand up to the Philistines and other Rephaim giants and hybrids that were on all sides of them, even at that time. And so King Saul, he is crowned the first king. And he is commissioned to attack the Amalekites and to wipe them from the face of the earth as equal justice for what the Amalekim tried to do, and the Amalekites tried to do when Israel had just come out from Egypt and were not ready to battle. And so King Saul, as king, and under the war edict and the rules of the king, he went out and to battle with the Amalekites, and he actually defeats them. And he captures a king Agag, but he doesn't kill him. Samuel is the one who actually has to kill him, and Agag is again a title, because you have a king Agag in the time of the Exodus, and then you have the Agagite bloodline that shows up in the time of Ezra. And so obviously there's a bloodline that continues from that family, not necessarily from the king, but maybe from his brothers or the wife or whatever, but they show up down the road. So those bloodlines continue. And this is why Saul is going to lose his kingdom, is because he didn't carry out what he was supposed to do. And in the time of King Saul, he's also going to fight the Philistines, right? He's going to have battles at Michmash and several other locations, and they're going to be fighting against what they call companies of spoilers, which is a very interesting term of what this means. And these were specially designated, powerfully trained hybrid warriors that were just the terror of all of the land. And people should know that these were the terrible ones. And terrible ones are the Rephaim, and there are many branches of the Rephaim. So if you look at Isaiah 25, and it's talking about these stout ones, which are the Azaz, these are ones that come from a city and have several branches. And if you look at Ezekiel 31 and 32, when it's talking about the terrible ones, or Ezekiel 28 or Isaiah 20 or Isaiah 14, these are the kings and the powerful ones that do terrible things to humankind. They're the terrible ones, and that's why they're called the terrible ones in the Bible. What's very interesting about that is that King Habada of the Cedar Forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh is located on Mount Hermon. And he is called the terrible one, and he's assigned by the gods to destroy humankind. And this is the one that Gilgamesh and Akeddon slay, which is why the gods are so upset. So you get this terrible term that's sort of coming down through history. And when you're into the passages about losing the ark, and the Philistines are trying to find a way to pacify the God of Israel and the Israelites, and they create these ephods from the mice, images of the mice. You have to understand and take that back. What this is talking about is not only the 5 Saranum kings as these golden ephods, but they are also representing the cities and the network, the mice network that is, as you take that back into Hebrew, it's like a web network of these smaller walled villages and stuff that are interconnected with the Pentapolis city. So it was a highly developed defensive mechanism that was almost impossible to conquer. And this is what King Saul and the Israelites had been going up against. Unfortunately, Saul, he gets killed in one of these battles, and now we have the time of David, who comes on just before. And David, when he comes onto the field, I mean, he's taken 5 smooth stones when he's going to go up against Goliath, not because he thinks he's going to miss, but there are 5 Saranum kings there that day. He's prepared to kill them all, and that's one of the wars that King Saul won. But when King David takes power, he is going to continue the wars against the Philistines and the rest and do a mopping up. So he's going to take on the Amalekites at Zilkag, and he's going to wipe those out first. And then he's going to, in Chronicles 18, he's going to take on Edom and Moab and Ammon and the Philistines and the Amalekim. Those are the 5 nations that he's looking to take on. And he is going to defeat the Philistines in the valley of the Rephaim and at Gath. And that's where he's also going to be killing some of the giants, and some of his mighty men are going to be killing some of the giants like Lami and Sippai and Saph and all of those particular giants. And after that, he is going to go into Syria and attack the Syrians. These are Horim of the southern part of the province. They have two kingdoms right in around the Mount Seir area, right beside where the Malachim are. And that's why the Edomites come out to meet David, and David wars with them in the desert area towards the south, because they used to alternate kingships between the two different kingdoms in terms of the leader. And you get those cities named back and forth if you're looking through Genesis 36 and you're looking at the kings of Edom. Those cities aren't all in Edom. Some of them are part of that Syrian location. So he defeats those two kingdoms as well. So the wars that David and Saul are fighting aren't just against regular people. These are still Rephaim and Rephaim hybrids that are dominating those nations. So you've got a 400-year span of Nephilim wars that were going on. So
wow. Jeez.
I know I covered a lot of detail there, but that was an ongoing thing. And just because the wars came to an end doesn't mean that the giants were gone from the face of the earth. They're just out of that area for the most part.
So I'd like to ask NPC if he had any questions related to this or just related to the subject in general before I ask a question from the chat.
Yeah, I did have some, but go ahead and take the chat question, because I've been taking notes and it might lead to some other things.
Okay.
I don't want to get off topic.
I'll take the chat question first. Jackie says Mount Hermon is where the Watchers are chained by the Golan Heights that are protected by the UN ?
I think I'm not sure exactly what she's asking, but let me unpack a little bit of it. So
I think it's at the 33rd parallel is what they mean.
Yeah,
okay.
So you've got Mount Hermon, but you have the Undolf mission that's on Mount Hermon. That's the largest manned operation of the UN in the world. And it's both Mount Hermon and the main sort of part of the mountain is in the 33rd degree latitude parallel, not longitude, but latitude. And they kind of, both of those locations where Mount Hermon is and where the Undolf organization is at, it kind of straddles the 33.33 degrees. And what's important about all of that is that because Mount Hermon is at 33.4 and I believe the UN is at 33.2. So it sort of centers that. And that's one of the most important prime numbers within the secret societies. And so it's interesting that when latitude and longitude were set up, that they actually set that up. And what's also interesting, and it was by one of the French kings, as I recall, I'd have to check which one, but it was first installed, it was for navigation for sure, but it was established in 1666, and you get this 666 number where you have that established, and you've got Mount Hermon at that 33rd degree. Now, what's also interesting with what the chat person had talked about is that is at the foot of the Mount Hermon is the Golan Heights, which is the most important strategic place in that area because it has the watershed for the control of the water, and it has the high ground for military operations. And also it has something else there that most people don't really kind of connect the dots at or connect the dots with. And that is Gilgal Rephaim. And if you're not familiar with Gilgal Rephaim, that is the wheel of the giants. That is the wheel, the wheel of the spirits. As you have different transliterations, and there's a few other different names, but this was one of the most important holy sites of the Rephaim after the flood. And it is a prehistoric site. It actually goes back to before the flood and somewhere between about 2700 to 3200 BC, from what my memory tells me on that. And this is a place that is also associated with the same culture as the Ugaritic texts, where you get the Semitic word HRM coming out of, which leads to a lot of different words in the area, including Herman and oaths and curse and things like that. And of course, where Mount Herman comes from. And so all of that sort of, and this is also the culture of King Og. And so you have so many different connections, and Gilgal means wheel. Now there's two different words for wheel that comes out of Hebrew, but the other one is more assigned to angels. That would be the Ophan, is the word, which is the Ophanim, which are the cherubim type angels that are with the eyes and the throne in Ezekiel. You get Ophanim as a name showing up with the three kinds of watchers, the cherubim, the seraphim, and the Ophanim in Enoch, and that's where that comes from. But the other word is Gilgal, as in wheel. Now, this is not to be confused with the base camp that Joshua sets up when he first crosses the Jordan. That's going to be their main camp, which is at Gilgal. But also understand that these Gilgal sites were a network of sacred sites that the polytheist priests used to travel from. So, or travel around and pilgrimage through. But Gilgal Rephaim would be the most important of those sites. So, very, very good question. And people need to know a little bit more about what's going on there. And also, I mean, this is not just a small area that they have. It's the largest manned operation they have in the world. They call it the Herman Hotel. But it is 75 kilometers by 10 kilometers wide. So 75 kilometers long, 10 kilometers wide. And so one can only imagine what they're doing in there. But what we also know is in that area is the Temple of Baal and the Temple of Pan. This is the area where Jesus went to at Caesar Philippi and just north of that, and did his famous oration making Peter to be the rock of the church going forward, and for recognizing him as the Messiah. And this is the location where these temples, where they call it the Rock of the Gods and the Gate to Hades. And what's interesting about that is the Rephaim were known as the travelers in the Ugaritic text, that they would go back from the underworld back and forth. So Gilgal Rephaim has hundreds of portals. These are little or dolmens, which are thought to be portals. And you also have this huge cave of Hades that is supposed to be the entrance to the underworld. And this is all in that area that is being covered off. And so the Rephaim were these travelers that went back and forth. So that means they're talking about the spirits or the shades, because Rapha can also mean dead spirit, right? Dead spirit of the Rephaim, because they're roaming, because these are the demons. These are not the ones that are locked in the abyss, in the sides of the abyss, in the prisons that Ezekiel 31 and 32 talk about. But these are the ones that are, roaming the earth. And what's interesting about that, we get this term that comes up with the fatlings of Bashan in Ezekiel 39, in the Gog War in the end times. And these are the passengers. And so you take passengers back to Hebrew, that's the word abar, that means crosses over, and I won't go into long detail about it, but this is one of those really important areas of the world that's important to the secret societies, to the bloodlines, that they've got this huge manned UN station and mission at. And I think it's going to come back into play, and it's connected with that double entendre that I talked about in terms of Sion and the Priory of Sion, that when they are going to crown the King of Jerusalem, which is the title that the Bourbon family still has, although there's another line that of Savoy that inherited through Lusignan, the kings of Cyprus, which I won't go into all the sort of details on tonight, will assert either from that line or another line when Antichrist is crowned in the temple with the king of Jerusalem, because in Joshua, the Jerusalem city is awarded to the Benjamites. And as you take and we haven't talked a lot about the bloodlines, but you have to understand that the people who set up the king of the Jerusalem title in 1118 in a small priory on the Rock of Zion, and use that as a double entendre, where the Anjou, de Payan, de Bouillon, and other families which founded the Knights Templar that take their bloodlines back to the Merovingians, who say they have the Benjamite and Davidic bloodline scioned into them, and they'll be claiming as their inheritance as a legitimate king of Jerusalem that title in the end time, at the time of the abomination. So a lot of interesting connections there.
Before I let NPC go,
Wow.
because I pretty much think it'll be just you two in a minute.
It's gonna be a meow storm.
Yeah. Do you have documents on the lion men of Moab that you, if someone were to email you for those?
I do.
Okay. I figured you did. Go ahead.
I also have documents on, for if they want other kinds of Nephilim. I have ones on a 2-part series on the serpent Nephilim. I also have ones on the Tengu, or the bird Nephilim. And I also have ones on whatever the dog people are. I think they're another form of Nephilim as well. I think the serpentine ones are the highest ones that were the rulers. The other ones were mostly warriors. But yes, I have series of documents on all of those.
Okay, so I have pinned the link to your website, which has your email on it. Anyone who wants that information, just email Gary. He will send it to you, and it's just a plethora of good information. And just real quick, one more thing is I'm getting my kids ready to go roller skating pretty soon. I can hear everything, and I can still talk to you guys, but I might sneak off the camera for just a moment. If that happens, I promise I'll be back, and I haven't left the show. So I don't think there was only one other question, and it was, where do you think Satan is now? Is he in the first heaven or in the abyss, or where is he?
Oh, he's definitely in this world. And he also has the ability to go into the third heaven, as Job discusses, because when the other sons of God go, he shows up with them. But he's the prince of this world, and he is not going to the abyss until the end of the end time. So after the Armageddon War, he goes to the abyss. He'll come out again one more time. So he's in control. And there's a hierarchy that's below him that the Psalms 82 talks about with the Council of Gods. That you have to connect with Deuteronomy 32 with the 70 nations. So you have this hierarchy of angels, and these are not angels in the abyss, right? They're not ruling from the abyss. Not all the angels went to the abyss, only the impassioned ones, and probably maybe the most evil of ones. So those ones would have been replaced after the flood with other angels. And if there was another second incursion, as I like to assert, then those ones would have gone to the abyss as well. So I do have I do have a series on the hierarchy of angels if people want that.
Okay.
And I also have a document on Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, which details the sort of the top half of that hierarchy.
Well, I guess this is a good time to ask some questions. I guess I would like to end up at the topic of maybe how this connects back to the modern day kingdoms like in France and maybe even the UK and Ireland, because I've been researching some things about like the Hill of Tara, for instance, and the Stone of Destiny, and they said that came over to the the New World, and there's this thing called the Decalogue Stone in Ohio, and then there's another Stone of Destiny in Adel, Virginia, for instance. So have you heard about some of these things too, and is that kind of tied into the dragon line? And then before we go into that, the seafaring peoples, would that be who these Philistines were, basically?
No, the Philistines were basically Hamites, so as opposed to the seafaring people, which are mostly Japhites. So no, I wouldn't say that, but they would have intermingled with them. So when they went from Egypt, because they went and migrated with Ham and Mizraim over to Egypt, the Philistine, or the as they're also known, or the Prist, they migrated to Cyprus after that, and that's where they intermingled with the seafaring people, which are mostly people from Japheth. And that's why when they show back up in the Middle East, when they're expropriating the land circa 1400 BC, or just before 14 to 1500, because they're there before Israel gets there, they're shown and depicted with these Greek helmets, right? It starts to all sort of make some sense when you sort of understand that. And I'll explain a lot of that in the Nephilim Wars as to where they came from. So if people want that series on the Philistines, I'll talk about that.
And so one of the reasons I asked about that in particular was because of the possible connection of the Egyptian princess that traveled with Jeremiah to Ireland, and that supposedly started this line. And so I thought maybe you were talking about them when you mentioned the scion.
Well, there's lots of different scions that go on, and scion is a grafting of
grafting of
scion. So, and that's another double entendre. But when you're talking about the Bethel stone and the stone of destiny, or the Akhenaten stone, you've got two different stones that are very, very important to Irish history and to English history. And one goes back to the stone that Jacob slept on, where you have the Jacob's ladder, and then you have Akhenaten's stone. And both of those make their way to Ireland in two different routes at two different times, and to the area of Tara, which you are also talking about, and into the bloodlines of the Tuatha De Danann, who are the fairy people, the fairy folk, and thought to have originated in Scythia and migrated there after the flood. They're also known to have been there before the flood. So in polytheist legends, they actually escape out of the abyss after the flood, and that's how they show up afterwards. And there's several different lines of these Tuatha De Danann, like the Picts in Scotland, or the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ones that migrate up north to Sweden and Germany and over into Russia. But what happens is that you have a couple of migrations of people that are going to be Israelite, thought to be in origin, or at least as the legend will go. The first one is not Israelite. This is from Skoda and her husband, and a daughter of Akhenaten, who after Akhenaten falls and the persecution against Atenism happens with the gods of Amun coming back into place, they're going to migrate to Spain and then over to Ireland and intermarry into the Tuatha De Danann bloodlines and the other peoples that are there. In the time of the Babylon diaspora and Jeremiah, for the people of the southern kingdom, you have the Bethel stone that is thought to have gone with Tamar, with the scribe of Jeremiah, and I think his name was Baruch, that takes that over to Ireland as well. Both of these stones move over to Ireland in about 800 to 900. I cover this off in pretty good detail in my book too, so you want more information, buy it on the book. But it comes over with the Dalriada migration out of Ireland from Tara to Scotland, who marries into the Pictish kingdoms, and they're going to have both of those stones as part of the Scottish kingdom, whom they take their name from, Skoda, moving forward. And then in the time of Robert the Bruce and those famous battles with Wallace and stuff, the stone of, I believe it's Akhenaten stone, is the one that is now sits beneath the throne of England. And if I reverse that, it's the other one. So it's one of the two. But I believe it's the Akhenaten stone that is underneath the throne of England, and the other one is still in Ireland. And this comes with that sort of bloodline of Egypt and the Tuatha De Danann, and this very powerful set of bloodlines that produced the Camelot dynasties as well in Welsh, and then were married back into the Dalriadic kingdoms in Scotland. So by the time you get this time of Robert the Bruce, you have not only the Tuatha De Danann bloodlines of Ireland, you have the Celtic bloodlines, you have the alleged Davidic bloodlines that the Gnostics like to believe, but you also had bloodlines that went over to the Merovingians out of the Camelot dynasty with Aragon at the time of Amenabad, and then back to the bloodlines of the Scottish kings through Sinclairs and other people that were participating with the Anjou and the Plantagenets, and all of them come out of that bloodline of those, of the three. That is basically when you're looking at Anjou, de Bouillon, and de Payon. Understand that the Plantagenet comes from the Anjou. And the Plantagenet is the very famous list of kings and what the presidents all like to take their genealogies back to. This is going to form into the most ennobled scion kingdom since the Merovingians, which is the Stuart Unicorn dynasty, right? And so it's important to understand all of those kinds of relationships and the intermarriages between the royal families, which is a Rephaim tradition, that they want to keep those bloodlines pure. So they want to continue to intermarry and to ennoble themselves with other bloodlines, because that creates a higher position for them in their culture. So the more ennobled, the more pure, and you have to have the genealogies to produce it, the higher you're going to be within the royal families around the world. So hopefully I answered that, but I've got a full chapter on Skoda and Tamar in my book. So
in the book.
And I'll cover a lot of that off.
In the book. I'm sorry, NPC. We do have another question from the chat, so I think we should get that one asked.
That's a good thing.
Rockman asks, has Gary noticed any parallels between ancient cults and the interests and policies being pushed today, specifically Babylonian?
Well, I think they're always at play. People, don't tend to recognize things because they're kind of almost common every day, but we don't really look at where they sort of came from. So if we're talking about, Babylon, let's first of all understand that, Babylon is that first kingdom of with the head of gold in the metallic empires of Daniel 2. And he is one of the terrible ones that Ezekiel is talking about. That he's going to, totally terrorize other rival terrible branch bloodlines like Pharaoh or the king of Tyre. You have to understand these are dual prophecies. They talk about prehistory with important details. They talk about a prophecy of that time, and then they have end time implications. And if you don't make those distinctions, you're going to think that Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28 or Ezekiel 31 or 32 or Isaiah 25 and on and on. There's like at least a half a dozen or more of these type of what I call dual prophecies. They look like they contradict themselves. You have to understand prehistory to understand what's going on and get the fuller meaning, but also understand they have some end time implications as well. And all doing what Satan tried to do in raising their throne to be like God and into heaven, as what Antichrist will do in the end time. So, what was the question again?
Or if you're seeing that let me go back to it. I got to scroll back.
If it related, if they.
To the Babylon.
Parallels
Okay.
of the,
Got it, right. So these dynasties moving forward are all the royal families that migrate to Europe. and that's where the bloodlines of Israel are going to be intermarried with down the road. That's where they scion in, according to the polytheists and the Gnostics. So, but Babylon is also the place where Judaism is enslaved for 70 years, starting at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And that's where you get a lot of the Sumerian influence. That's where Kabbalism starts to come back from, right? And so when you get all of these different beliefs, whether or not it's with Lilith or the serpent seed doctrine, that starts to come back into Kabbalism, which is different than the Essenes polytheism that was there before, which goes back to Egypt. And that's an influence from a religious perspective that sort of dominates things and hits into the culture down the road. So you've got all of these Babylonian things coming down through history that are a lot of those traditions that were going on in Babylon. And so when we look at, like the laws that come out of, the Babylon empires and Hammurabi, we're going to see that type of law that's going to come in place into the world. It may be looking like a variation of Old Testament law or Sharia law, but it's going to be like that, and it's going to be imposed on the whole world. And that's why you've got such an open position by these polytheists that are running all the governments around the world to Sharia law, because it's an avenue to bring them in, Christians and Jewish people, in to the overall polytheist law that they want to bring in with the New World Order that I call the Nephilim world order that they're trying to bring about, right? You see things like Baal, and Baal actually has a connection to Babylon through Hadad. And you notice the word Hadad, and that shows up in a lot of the writings that come down from Mesopotamia, just different transliterations of the same god. So you're seeing these arches of Baal being set up all over the world. That should be no coincidence. And Baal is the god of Mount Hermon, right? So just to give a few examples, and you see all of the architecture of these ancient polytheist systems, whether or not it's in the US or Canada, all around the world, they build temple-like buildings that used to be built in the time when those religions were popular, and we see them being built for government buildings or the universities and the degrees that are given out. I mean, you're talking about an overlay of symbolism to the cult of knowledge, just as you get a degree in university for whatever, a PhD or master's or business degree. You get degrees as you move up in the mystical religions. Like a third degree is the old system of an adept, 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite, which is why they have buildings to match, because they're occult knowledge that comes from the 7 sacred sciences. One needs to sort of scrutinize everything the governments are doing and say, is that really secular, or is that really that polytheist invasion? And you're seeing more and more of it. So you have the legitimization of abortion all over the world as a human right. Well, that is right out of polytheist ritualism of child sacrifice. So yeah, you see more and more of that overlapping into laws and into policy. And when they're talking about these open borders, understand that the Roman Empire was all open borders, but they had very tight totalitarian control where the king is worshipped as a god. You had the same thing in all of the metallic empires. So for this end time empire to be built, they have to start moving that in that direction. So if you start to look at what they're doing through a little bit different lens, you're going to have an eye-opening experience. But you need to know history to do that.
Will we see these giants again? Like, you know how it says such as in the days of Noah, so shall be in the son coming of the Son of Man be. I never get that one right, but you know the scripture.
Yep.
Do you think we're going to see this kind of war-like thing again with giants before the end times?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that is not just that particular verse is just not talking about, violence or not expecting the end time. And I'm not going to demean in any way that that's part of it. But that's part of the overarching signs that, it's right there with the fig tree generation. So it's a generation that's specific for one time, and it's going to be like the days of Noah. And you would expect that Jesus would use perfection in the words and the language that he uses. And of course he does. That's why I'm just always amazed at anytime I read anything that's recorded from him. And so if you go to Genesis 9:28 and 29, and it talks about Noah's life. And the words are, and the days of Noah were. I think it says 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood. He used those exact same words. Now, that the Old Testament comes out of Hebrew and the New Testament comes out of Greek, but the words mean exactly the same thing as you apply them. And I think he was telling us that we need to learn about the 600 years before and the 350 years after to understand what is coming in the end time. So it's an overarching thing. So that means you had giants both before and after the flood, and everything else that was going on. I mean, you had Babel going on, which is where the religion of the end time comes from, Babylon, right? We need to understand what was going on there, and that Nimrod was an antichrist-like figure, not necessarily Nephilim because he's the son of Cush, but certainly Gibborim were a mighty one and became one, whatever that means. And I think perhaps maybe from the knowledge that was gained because he's reestablishing the knowledge of the ancient world and the Enochian mysticism from before the flood. And so before the flood, you have the 7 sacred sciences that Enoch develops and separates them into those 7 disciplines, knowledge that he learned from Cain, according to the polytheists. And that's where he sets up his sun-worshipping bull cult to hide these mysteries and keep them secret from the mundane and to develop them, which they need mystery schools for, which is the formation of the first secret societies, which is why they have the same degrees and the same cult of knowledge and Gnostics that we have today. And they take their patriarchs back and their founding back to their writings, their history. And that explains why Jubal, Nama, and Tubal-Cain are listed of all of the descendants of Cain, because those are the patriarchs of this religion and cult of knowledge that renaissanced in the time of Lamech and his offspring. And this is the knowledge that merges with the fallen angels, or the gods as they would talk about in polytheist religions, that takes that antediluvian world to a level we're not even at yet. A level of knowledge that could build things like the pyramids, which the Freemasons and Gnostics accredit that knowledge came from Enochian sciences and knowledge, the 7 sacred sciences, plus the knowledge from the gods. And it explains things like Stonehenge. It explains things like Machu Picchu, all things that we can't do with the technology today. And if that's the case, and we're not in the end time yet, our knowledge is still developing, and we're just catching up to that level. Now, you also get, coming out of polytheism, all of these different fabulous creatures.
Yeah.
Whether they're centaurs, or whether it's Pegasus, or Chimera. And Chimera is a term that we're hearing a lot more of. And all of these different things that are supposed to be just figments of somebody's imagination that come down. I think they're recording things that were actually created. I think there was DNA manipulation that was going on, and we're just starting to get into that level of understanding today. Now let's roll forward to possible application. If we look at Joel 1 and 2, and we look at Revelation 9, you have the 200 million man war, and you have this war before the Armageddon war of Joel 3 and 4. And you get these incredible looking creatures that are fighting a battle. You know, they have bodies of horses and heads of men and long hair and scorpion-like and all sorts of different things that are going on. I think these are weapons that are being designed through the merging of AI, through the merging of DNA manipulation, crossbreeding, whatever, all these things to form these types of weapons, and as well as planet-destroying weapons that are going to be used so that they can convince people that you can actually stand up and fight against the God of the universe. You have a chance to win, right?
Yep.
Otherwise, why would humans fight against powerful beings like the loyal angels of God and God Almighty? And I think that's what we're seeing described in those wars, right? And so I think we're going to have that going on. Now, we're going to have also whatever is in the abyss released. And you're going to have those kings released that are in the sides of the abyss. Nephilim kings before the flood, Rephaim after the terrible ones. And I think they're going to need bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because they're demons. So you're going to need some sort of clone body or some...
The golems.
You know, yeah. Now, if we're going to have fallen angels who were put into the abyss for their impassioned sins of creating Nephilim and Rephaim, both before and after the flood, one would presume they're going to do that again. I would also speculate that angels that aren't in the abyss, who know that their fates are sealed, and they do, because Jesus told them that when he went in 1 Peter down to the abyss. I think that's what he told them. And that Corinthians talks about they didn't anticipate the resurrection. Otherwise, they would have ensured Jesus wasn't crucified.
Right.
Right? So while he was still in the grave, he goes and talks to them. And I think he sealed their their fate to the lake of fire at that point in time. But all they have left is to try and destroy as much as they can and mislead as many people. So I think angels who are knowing we're getting close to the end time, knowing there's very few short years, knowing others are going to be released from the abyss, they would not hesitate at that point, with nothing to lose as being rebellious angels, to do it again. There's nothing to stop them, and to reinforce the army and to convince people to rebel against the God of the Bible, and that they actually have a chance. And then we also don't know what's going on in Antarctica with all of the rumors and things and theories about giants and stasis. What we do know is fallen angels were helping giants all the way through as their progeny. Polytheist religions suggest that they help some of them survive. You get things about in the earth, off the earth, and there's no reason why they couldn't have put some in stasis as well with the technology that they would have provided. And Antarctica would be the perfect place. So I don't know whether that's the case, but I leave myself open. But the short answer to your question is all of the days of Noah, I think, are coming in the end time.
Okay.
That's how bad it's going to be.
I think I'm going to let NPC talk. Poor guy, I've been keeping him from it, but that is exactly what I think too, and I appreciate that your opinion seems to equal mine on the days of Noah. So I just wanted to say thank you. I don't obviously have that good of an answer that you had, nor would I be able to say it that well. But overall, that confirms what I feel. So okay, back to NPC.
Well, I had a few comments, and then I do have a good question, I think. So we've mentioned Mount Hermon again. So not only is the 33rd parallel significant, but today is also 33 days from the election when they announced the COVID thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's and about the COVID thing, one of the proposed ways to deal with that is this vaccine with luciferase, which is a borrowed biological feature from like fireflies, and in this particular case. So you're getting a little bit of a blend of the Days of Noah stuff there too, I think, incidentally. But you were talking about these mixtures of folks. Is that really what are referred to as the destroyers as well? And that they are the ones released from this pit in order to destroy. And then I was going to ask if that relates to this peace treaty covenant, perhaps even the Abraham Accord that we're seeing here. And so also, how is it exactly, what is the significance of the covenant itself? And what is that? Are you aware of like the mechanics that, what goes on with that?
Okay, there's a lot there. I'll see whether...
sorry, there was one other part. So, because it might...
if that wasn't enough, hold on. Wait, there's
this
more.
actually colors it well. Sorry.
Okay.
Because then I noticed here you had the Melchizedek bull folks, and so I wondered if maybe there was some way the covenant could be explained there.
Yeah, I think that's going to be part of it, the Melchizedek order. That's the Canaanite Melchizedek order, and I cover that off in the book for people. Understand they counterfeit everything. So that'll be used in conjunction with the King of Jerusalem title. But let me just sort of start back at the beginning of your question. So when you're talking about the destroyers that are coming out of the abyss, so Abaddon and Apollyon, which is a title for the leader, means destroyer in both Hebrew and in Greek, and I think that's Azazel. And I won't go down a rabbit hole there because I'll forget where I'm at. But I think it's Azazel because he is the one who taught war to everybody on Earth, whether or not it's humans or Nephilim. He's the one who taught the art of war. He's the one who taught them how to make weapons. And so I think that as being the host of heaven, as Enoch talks about, or the host of the angels that went into the abyss, the leader of it, he's the one that's coming out. And that would be very, very appropriate. And he also brings out these other scorpion beings, that, I think have a very close identification with something that a goddess by the name of Tiamat created. And they show up in other cultures as these scorpion creatures as well, and even with the Kishamaya. And these things had the ability to be planet destroyers. They were created by the goddess to keep the lower gods in line, because they were always trying to rebel. Eventually, they killed Tiamat and they actually overthrow the parent gods and all the different pantheons around the world. Well, they're called the Akraba Malu, and Gerda Balu, two different names for the same creatures. There's actually relief pictures of these things around the Middle East, and I've got a commentary on this with the pictures of some of these reliefs. A crab is the Hebrew word for scorpion. And so I think these are the beings that were put into the abyss because these were planet-destroying beings, right? And they were created to protect the parent gods. And so I think these are the beings that are going to be coming out, and they are described exactly like these inscriptions. So I think that's a different thing that's coming out with the impassioned angels. So that's the first thing. Now, I think you were moving on after that into the covenant in Daniel 9:27 and the Jerusalem location for the ambassadors to be located that Trump has done. Was the next part of the question?
Well, yeah, because it seems as though with them titling it that, even because I understand there's been some
with the Abraham.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Because there's something about the actual covenant. Because there was one with Noah, with Shem making the altar right as soon as they got off the ark, and then there was another one with Abraham
Yep.
But I'm only aware of 2 covenants, and then I think there's a third made
Yes,
when.
Galatians talks about the covenant for the Muslims and the Arab people. It's the slave covenant.
Hmm.
And so I think that's so you're going to have like a new covenant. You have the new covenant of the Christians, and you have the Old Testament covenants, and then you've got Galatians 4 is where you're going to find that between Hagar and Sarah. So,
And that's Ishmael.
Yep, that's Ishmael. And so there's a covenant there that the Bible talks about, and I think is a separate covenant. Whatever you people want to have an interpretation on that. And I think when as they're doing this, they're appealing to a religious base that is a move to bring about the universal religion, because not only do they have to harmonize the 3 monotheist religions for the end time, they also have to homogenize those and bring them back, as they would believe, to the original state of polytheism, because they believe monotheism went rogue from polytheism. They believe, the polytheists do, that Moses brought back the religion of Heliopolis that he was educated in, which the Essenes say they have that pure religion that Moses brought back. And then at the time of the monarchy, to create a better image and sort of legend for the monarchy, they developed this monotheist religion, and that's where it goes rogue. But before that, you have all 3 of the monotheist religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I know a lot of people say Islam's not a monotheist religion, but they're called a monotheist religion. So don't go crazy out there, people. Understand that they believe in one God. Whether or not you believe that's the God of the Bible, that's not the issue. But it's the homogenization of that into this Abraham covenant that is going to have to be part of the political thing that moves down the road. So now if you understand that, and you understand that universal religion is going to come first before the 10 kingdoms do, and that she's going to control those 10 kingdoms, and the covenant is what assembles this larger world covenant, right? And that's Daniel 9:27 for the last 7 years. And this is the covenant in Isaiah that God is going to annul at the midpoint of the last 7 years, aka the abomination, aka when Judah recognizes Antichrist isn't their true Messiah anymore, and they're going to flee to the desert, and the angel Satan's going to spew a river in Revelation 12, where if you're reading in Isaiah about the annulling of the covenant, you have this overwhelming scourge and this river coming out. They're all talking about the same thing. Then you understand that there's going to be a religious nature to this covenant that is a political treaty for not only the world, but also for Israel, for their protection, right?
Yeah. So they say peace and safety, like in is it First or Second Thessalonians 5:3?
Yep. Yes, and they're also permitted in that covenant to start doing a daily sacrifice on an extremity of the temple. On
one of the wings, quote unquote,
one of the wings. Yeah, the word is, I think it's outstretched in the King James Version Bible. If you take that back to Hebrew, it means extremity or a wing of the temple.
And they've been counting the hairs on some heifers recently. So, and then that's an attempt to make you clean because so much death has occurred on the grounds there, right?
Yes. And so that means Jerusalem has to be set up as more of a world city that they're starting to set up, and that it's important to have those embassies being established in Jerusalem, and that you have this Abraham covenant as a political thing that's got religious sort of overtones that's starting to weave that together as the New World is trying to piece itself together. And you're going to have a high level of catastrophes happen before you even get there.
Well,
So as we talk about the birth pangs between earthquakes, wars, pestilence, and pandemics, the coronavirus would be part of that as they increase in their intensity. And the seals are going to be open just before, I think, the last 7 years, as you get this sort of conquering of the world as the writers come out, which will have the same catastrophes as in the birth pangs, but now in a 25% proportion. So they're going to see destruction of 25% of the earth and 25% of the people. So we're going to see apocalyptic-like things leading up, which is going to open up the door for the false prophets to come out for Babylon, for the universal religion, which starts to do prophets that are going to make predictions of, if you do not convert, the whole world will be destroyed. But to give you some chances, this is going to happen. They're going to have 10 of these apocalyptic prophecies according to the Mary cult, where they have 6 initiates that were initiated in the 90s at Medjugorje. I don't know whether they're the false prophets that do it, but what I do know is the Mary cult has a very powerful influence over Catholicism, and I think you're going to have that universal religion centered out of Rome, understanding that in Peter and in all New Testament applications, Babylon is defined, when you take that back to Greece, as an allegory for Rome. And it's the one situated on 7 hills, and there's already a universal religion there, and we see they're moving very quickly into a polytheist position, and I think the Jesuits are doing a very good control for positioning that. You got the World Council of Churches at play. So I think when you get these prophets of doom and having contrived disasters fulfilled that they're going to predict, they're going to scare everybody into this universal religion, which will set up the ability to do a political, religious covenant that will not only be set up for the whole world, but for the Middle East as well. So, and Israel will have their safety until the Gog Alliance attacks them just before the midpoint of the last 7 years.
Well, and I've been seeing that there's a lot of talk across theological lines even about a Sunday covenant. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're explaining right there is going to culminate in this, where they kind of view the earth as the goddess and so on and so forth, rally around that.
Yeah, and the people of Israel are going to, or the people of Judah, but also understand lost Israel is going to be awakened around the world as well. I think 144,000 are part of that whole thing to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth and to lost Israel so that they're awaking. But visible Judah today, whether or not they're all descendants of Judah, there's at least a remnant, because we know God's going to fight for them, and we know they flee from Jerusalem at the midpoint and God protects them until the time of the Exodus, where the lost Israel is going to meet up with them, Ezekiel 37, and probably with another resurrection in there as well, which is the dry bones. But they're going to have to believe that the one who negotiates this covenant is Jewish, or at least has Jewish bloodlines, if they're going to believe he is the Messiah that they're going to, sign on to, and who's going to permit them to do the sacrifices on a wing of the temple. And you're going to have a strong universal religion presence to permit the Jewish people to do their sacrifices anywhere close to the mosque as it situates today. So there has to be that religious component. So I think all building blocks in that direction.
Well, and that said, there was an effort even to try and blow the shofar this year from the Temple Mount, but they wouldn't permit that
Yeah.
either. So
Yeah.
but there's always that incremental approach toward, what you're explaining there. Yeah.
Yeah. And understand that we're going to have to be watching for many antichrists. And in Matthew and Mark, Jesus says there's antichrists plural, just as there's false prophets that are plural. So there's going to be a lot of rival antichrists, not only within the bloodlines of European bloodlines, but also from around the world. So it starts to make sense if you understand that when Eastern religions look towards a Lord Maitreya from their end of the world, or the Shia, the people of Persia for the most part and in that region, they have the Mahdi that they have in their Hadith, which is separate from the Hadiths of the Sunni or the Sufi. They have the Mahdi that is their Messiah. And so you're going to see a lot of rival messiahs in the end time. So we just can't just be pointing here and there. I mean, this is going to be the one that negotiates the covenant, right? But it's the real covenant, not some peace treaties along the way. And he's probably going to be relatively unknown until that point in time when he starts his ascent to become Antichrist. And he's not Antichrist until he is crowned as such in the temple at the abomination at the midpoint, which is going to be problematic for Christians to understand who he is and who is going to be attacking him and identifying him. I mean, we're going to be enemies of the state, right? And that sets up a counterfeit opportunity so that he hasn't been crowned. So there'll be other antichrists first. So I think the Gog war is led by another antichrist type figure, and Gog in the New Testament, as it's used, and you take that back to Greek, even though it comes in a space coming out of Hebrew, its definition is an antichrist type figure. And Gog and Magog are giants as the offspring of Iapetus in Greek mythology. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you have both of those names, that are Japhethites that, went to Greece and the seafaring people and I think they actually took names of giants, Gog and Magog, but then you've got other names from other peoples as well that are giant names as well that come down through other branches of Noah. So, but I think that there's a strong case that you're going to have an Antichrist figure that's leading that war. But they're all Antichrist type figures in the bloodlines. They all want to be the dragon Messiah.
Right.
And you have that rivalry. Right. That's why you've had wars all throughout. There can only be one dominant family that would be reigning as king of the earth. And they all want that. So why.
Is that what Dracula means?
Well, it actually means son of a dragon. And Dracula is comes out of the word dragon, or drakon out of Greek, and a similar word out of Latin. And that word is basically Greek for not only the serpent, but for the watchers. So, I mean, it's the allegory of the bloodline and of the dragon bloodline, because that's the allegory that they use for the patriarchal bloodline is the dragon, right? And of course, the Nephilim looked like serpents, who looked like the seraphim watchers who produced them, right? And the seraphim is a fiery serpent-faced angel who were in charge of religion and government, as Daniel 4 talks about those watchers coming down from heaven to the earth. And these are the rebellious ones that created the original Nephilim, and that's why you have all this serpentine imagery in religion and with the kings and with the gods, right? It's all interconnected. So when you look at Dracula being based on Vlad the Impaler, Vlad the First and Vlad the Second, he's actually Vlad the Impaler is actually introduced or initiated into the Sarkani Rond, or the Ordo Draconis, which is the bloodlines of royal families trying to take back thrones that they have lost on the continent, and to pursue the pursuits of Thoth, which is the god of wisdom out of Egypt, right? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And it gets even deeper. So Vlad the Impaler is a red hair, hazel-eyed descendant of the Tuatha De Danann, who come out of Scythia, who are the same ones who migrated over to Ireland as the red hair, hazel-eyed Tuatha De Danann. And he is one of those pure bloodlines. He's one of the most ennobled pure bloodlines. And this is the same one that Prince Charles proudly takes his genealogy back to. And again, I can send people the link on that if you want to see some articles on that. They keep those genealogies.
And also, just to remind everybody, in the book, there is a section of the House of the Dragon that you get into, the Order Draconis and the Serpents and Dragons, that we actually covered on a different show one time together. And I wanted to ask you this because it's coming up several times, that I think CERN is set to open back up in 2021, or to start back up. And there's a question of, are they bringing through just information, or do you think that they could be bringing through the what the guy Geordie Rose likes to say from Black? What is he from? What is he? D-Live, right? Is he the one that he makes the quantum computers? And he likes to say the old ones, the ancient ones, like the Lovecraftian characters of old, or the fallen angels, that's what they're really trying to bring back through this? Or is it just information that they're coming through with?
Well, if you look at Ezekiel 31 and 32, where we talked about those in the abyss, both the angels and the Rephaim and the Nephilim kings, they're actually talking to some of these kings. So one presumes that there's an ability for them to, at least adepts and purebloods, to talk to ones that are in the abyss, however, how much and whatever advice that they get. But they're also talking to the ones who are outside the abyss. So I think when they're trying to get into the abyss, they're trying not just to talk. I think they're trying to actually release.
Yeah, just break open the seal.
Just break open the seal, and before the end time. But they'll accept the end time if they have to. But they're trying to get there beforehand. There's no doubt about that. And in my sort of understanding of how they're matching up quantum mechanics and AI, to go interdimensional, because I think the underworld is in a different dimension within the earth.
Right.
Well, and in the iPet Goat video, they use the Dancer of Destruction, which the Nataraja character is the your Shiva type figure, and that's the statue in front of CERN, of course. So
yeah, and Shiva is the destroyer god, and it's on the church of Apollyon, the site where it was located, and Apollyon is, the
god killer that they're wanting, right?
Yeah, the one that's in the abyss, the king of the abyss, the destroyer. I mean, all the language and the symbology and the allegories and the rituals that they do are all about that original religion and original ancient gods that were around before the flood and are coming back again. They want the new Atlantis to be built, right? They want that age where angels intermixed with humans and they procreated with humans to create the Nephilim. They're trying to recreate that, and that's why Bacon wrote the book New Atlantis, where it's an end time where you have a religion that works in harmony with science, polytheism and science together, and you have a one world government. I mean, they use the same type of imagery over and over and over if you understand what they're talking about. Or if the Bushes are talking about 1,000 points of light, that's about harmonizing that illicit counterfeit spirit from the angelic beings within the descendants of the Nephilim, to bring that together so that they can vibrate or evolve into gods with that harmony. But to do that, they need a universal religion and they need a universal government. And then they can bring that seed back together, but only for people with the gene of Isis or the spark of the divine or the specific bloodline, and probably all of the above, that will be permitted to live in that new age, which is the new Atlantis. The rest are only going to be there for servitude, food, and rituals.
Do you think that irradiating the water with Fukushima is probably part of that plan? That maybe they prefer an environment as such.
No, I think what they're really trying to do, and they've done all throughout time, is they've tried to present and have their Antichrist, their dragon Messiah, take over the world. And once they do that, they can eliminate all the inferior humans, or at least to the level that they want. So the reason why I say that is because if you look at those metallic dynasties, which are all Nephilim dynasties or Rephaim dynasties, and they had those also, dynasties before the flood, and you understand that they are trying to take over the whole world, and you understand from Daniel that Michael holds them back.
He's the restrainer, correct? Is that the katakon, the Greek word?
He could certainly be the restrainer. I kind of lean there. Could be the Holy Spirit, as other people believe as well. But either way, both of them are removed. Well, depending on how you want to look at the restrainers, the restrainer,
the binding. It's the binding, right?
Yeah, the restrainer isn't going to stop the 10 King Empire from taking power. He never stopped Rome from taking power. He restrained it from allowing them to become so powerful and to permit an Antichrist, right? Their dragon Messiah. So I think Michael is removed sometime after the 10 kings are put together. Now, the Holy Spirit is still here testifying through Christians in the first 3.5 years, because when the affliction and the tribulation of the saints are going on, you're instructed in Luke and in Mark not to worry about what to say, because the Holy Ghost will provide that, will provide you the wisdom, which goes back to Sophia, which is the Greek word, unfortunately, that's used for the Holy Spirit. But they're both talking about the same event, and they're here through the first 3.5 years. So I think what I said earlier was Michael permits the 10 King Empire from coming into shape, so he's still here. He's not here until the abomination, right? So I think at that point in time, both the Holy Spirit and Michael leave. So I'm not quite sure which one is the restrainer. I lean a little bit more towards Michael these days than the Holy Spirit. But don't let people fool you that the Holy Spirit won't be here in the first 3.5 years, because Mark and Luke testify that the Holy Spirit is here, and that is the Spirit that's going to provide the knowledge to testify before kings and for God and Jesus in that period of time. And that's before the abomination, but after the start of the last 7 years. So they're going to be here. But I lean a little bit more for Michael. And then Michael stands up to fight again sometime after the last 3.5 years, as Daniel 12 talks about and Revelation 12 talks about. Okay.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to break this up for just a second, because I thought there was a good question in the chat, and it's from Rocky Shepherd. He said, does the devil know when the tribulation starts?
I don't think so, because if you knew that, then you would have a better idea as to when the rapture is going to take place, and they would make, that knowledge would be out there a little bit more than what it is. And here's what we do know, though, is that only God knows when the rapture is going to take place and when Jesus is going to come back. Not even the Son knows that. So I'm thinking, and I think it's going to be, that happens sometime just after the midpoint of the last 7 years. So after the midpoint. But I don't think Satan knows when that is.
May I interject?
Yep.
Just to mention, there is a hadith in the Islamic traditions, and pardon me if I trip on some of these terms or use them incorrectly, but this tale is featuring a hairy creature, which reminds me of Esau when you were talking about bloodlines. But I believe his name's Shem. Anyway, these guys are in a storm. And they end up marooned on an island. So they meet this hairy creature, and he takes them to his master, who's chained up. And while they are talking to this guy, I think they do describe him with certain features, like maybe red hair and being muscular, etc. He asks some questions, and what it pertains to are the seasons. So yes, we don't know the day or the time, but we are taught to know the seasons. So I think even Satan in this case, if that's who this figure is, he too would know the season perhaps, because he does ask about the date palms and the circumstance of the water and things like that. Sorry, if you know about it, I won't go on.
No, I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I haven't taken a lot of time to study hadiths. I'm very familiar with the Quran, but the hadiths there's so many different ones. Yeah,
Al-Jassazar, that's his name, the hairy guy.
So, but I think that would be very similar, that we can know the seasons, but that's it. And I don't think that Satan would know any more than that, because this is about when the mystery of God is revealed in that, and the conclusion of the last 7 years of the weeks of years that were set aside, as Daniel prophesied. So I would lean that he doesn't know, but he knows sort of approximately what to look for, and the time frame. So that, I think that's the best knowledge that he would have. And obviously, I mean, they didn't know about the resurrection. So, I mean, there's some things that God keeps to himself, and this would be one of it. And I don't think Satan knows. But they're very smart, and they know when the times are getting closer. And I think they're always trying to speed up the times. I think they would like to have the end time at a time that's not ordained.
Right.
Well, they know that he doesn't want to spoil the seed. So I think that's one thing they know, like what they can do to force their hand, even if it's not a good hand they have,
Yeah. And also another reason why I think Satan wants to speed it up, not only to try and discredit God in some way, which I don't know how that would be possible in a legitimate sense, is that if they were to be able to bring about the end time beforehand, then that means not all of the names that are written in the book of life would be fulfilled, right? So that would be a destruction of a certain portion of humanity. And those names were listed before creation. And we're living in the period of the Gentiles, so all of the Gentiles' names can be fulfilled. Israel and Judah have a separate sort of date with destiny. That's all linked in Ezekiel 37 in terms of how that's resolved, which happens in the last 3.5 years as well, and part of Jesus' coming. So I would say that would be a big motivation for them, is to shorten how many humans are going to be resurrected to be like angels and judge angels in the future time.
I wanted to say, just like you said that only the Father knows, that's just like a Galilean wedding. The Galilean wedding was in such a way that nobody knew until the Father decided that the bride would be ready, her bridesmaid would be ready, the son would be ready, but nobody would know. And the Father would decide, possibly in the like the scriptures say, he'll come like a thief in the night. The Father would decide in the middle of the night, and everybody was to be prepared and be ready. To get up and have the service at that point. And that is what this will be like, that we're not going to know. It's going to happen in such a way that when it's time, we better be ready, just like that, because here it is. He's here. It's time to go. Everybody's got to be totally prepared.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Or suffer the consequences thereof. And so
I'm thinking for us in this community, hopefully we will be prepared.
Yeah. So if you're not going to be raptured, then hopefully you're going to survive into the millennium, or you're going to be one of those ones who do not get deceived into taking the mark and are resurrected into the millennium to rule with Jesus. So it's not over, but it's one of those things you don't want to miss when that event happens. So try and be prepared for it.
So I had another question. When we were talking about CERN, I couldn't help but wonder, do you ever think of that as a kind of like a domain,
Well, as Mount Hermon, yeah, I
like
do.
an artificial one?
Yeah, I think so, because you've got the the rock of the gods, which is the gate to Hades, located at Mount Hermon. So I think that's a real good indication. And I thought about something else as you were, and after, when we were talking about the religious nadir and of the last 7 years and the covenant.
Yeah.
And we were talking about Mount Hermon before as well. So this is the place where the angels in Enoch swore their oath
Among themselves.
among themselves. Yeah, the harem anathema, to carry it out, an irrevocable vow to the end.
Yep.
Because they didn't think that he would damn them all because they didn't know about salvation, like you
Yeah.
were saying. Yeah.
And
They didn't know they were replaceable.
And Herman is rooted in those words curse and oaths and sacred area and stuff like that. So you've got all of those temples there. So I think there's something to how they're going to overlay the whole idea of Mount Sion, Herman, into Mount Zion, Jerusalem, and just sort of weave that back into one sort of amalgamated, conflated ideology.
I also wanted to ask for somebody in the chat. This might have been relevant when we were talking about Dracula or one of the other matriarchal lines, but does Enlil or Enki factor into this in some way?
Well, they're fallen angels for sure. There, a lot of people raise Enki to be Satan.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot.
And then in dualism, then Enlil is the god of the Bible, right? And don't fall for that, because neither is the case. So Satan is the prince of this world, right? If you understand, and I know most people probably don't, but I reference the two levels of gods. You have the parent gods, you have the offspring gods, or the lower gods, and then you have the demigods. The parent gods created God offspring. So let's move. I'll do Greece and move back to Enlil and Enki so that people understand. So Poseidon and Zeus, two of the more famous gods, are also like Enlil and Enki. They are Olympian gods. They're the second-tiered gods. Zeus is the offspring of Kronos, and Poseidon is the offspring of Kronos as well, and I think Gaia, and could be another female god. So they're created within the physical universe as spiritual gods, not with human flesh necessarily, but certainly with a changeling sort of quality like angels would have. And they're the ones who produce with the offspring to create Nephilim. So heroes of old, or the Titans, because Hercules is the offspring of Zeus. Poseidon produces 10 demigod kings as the offspring of the lower gods. So bear with me a little bit here. So you have this pantheon of gods now over in Sumer that's set up very similar to the pantheon gods over in Greece. So whether or not it's Tiamat, that's one of those parent gods, and her consort Alu. You have the god Anu with Ninkarsag and a couple other consorts that they have, produces offspring gods Enlil and Enki. And both are part of the same dualistic pantheon that's polytheistic, worshiping them. So God is not going to be part of anything. He's not an angel, as Gnostics like to claim, and how that whole structure that people portray Enlil and Enki together is essentially asserting. God is higher. Satan is trying to be like God, right? So Satan is part of that whole part of the parent gods with whatever other gods. So whoever Enlil and Enki are, they are other fallen angels that are lower down into the hierarchy. Perhaps, maybe, and they are also seemingly gods that were before the flood, right? So they would have been part of that original ones, because they're going to disappear and they're going to be replaced by other gods in the Sumerian pantheon afterwards. And so they say in polytheism, in the legends and mythologies and religions of Enki and Enlil, it's that, Enlil is the one that's not looking after humankind like God of the Bible does, and he's the one who brings the flood. Enlil is the one who's or Enki's looking after humankind, brings knowledge, all that sort of stuff, and they're both serpent gods. I think those are just lower level gods that are described within, below the, let's say, the top 7 angels leading the rebellion plus Satan, because you have 7 and 8 as a constant with sort of a supreme being, and that's where Satan would fit, trying to create a counterfeit organizational structure like God has.
Well, I have a question. So you were talking about the 1,000 points of light and how that was necessary to cause this almost like vibration. It seemed like is that kind of similar, that they have to fulfill this pantheon to do this, to have this, to share that power somehow?
Yes. They're trying to bring back the ability to be like Nephilim, right? They're trying to be those demigods. They want to be a physical god in the physical universe. They can't ever become a god in the third heaven. And that's not what's being offered. It's about being a god in the physical world. And the Nephilim were exactly that. They were the demigods, an offspring of a god and a human female, as the definition of demigod goes. And the Nephilim were originally had an immortal spirit in them and a body to match. It was regenerating, and that's why you get a lot of regenerating science fiction and horror movies that's sort of reflecting that, like with Drinking of the Blood with the vampires and Dracula, right? You sort of get where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
And in Genesis 6:3, God steps in, not without coincidence, when the fallen angels, the sons of God, go to human females and create the Nephilim. He limits life to 120 years. And that's why the body dies of the original Nephilim and the Rephaim, but the spirit doesn't go to sleep.
Yes. Oh,
And
yeah, because there's some that can't sleep, right?
Yes.
There's only some that don't do that.
And they're not permitted to go to heaven, so they have to wander the earth. Or
now, is that like the Cain
they're in the
spirit
abyss
too? Because he was forced to wander as well? Is it similar?
Well, that was physically. We don't know. We're not told scripturally, but it's possible. Certainly possible, but he's also human. So one would think that all humans sleep, but Cain may be the exception. I'll leave that to God. But what I do know is when Jesus is encountering these demon evil spirits, they are like in dry places, in desert places, and they're thirsting for a body to possess so that they can interact with the earth, right?
That's very much like the dry bones, and is it Ezekiel 37 maybe, where he goes to the valley of Jehoshaphat and the Holy Spirit tells him to speak to the bones? Is it because of that kind of similar thing there?
I don't think so. What's going on, I would look at Ezekiel 37 as completely different, although I understand what you're saying. What the demons that are wandering, they want to interact with the world, and that's why they're going to need something to interact in the end time. But trouble is, with a human host, they resist, so it's not a symbiotic relationship. It's not an avatar relationship that Satan would have done with Judas, and or with the Nakash, which is, I think, why the Nakash actually betrayed humankind the way that it did and was punished thereof. And that's the effect that gods in the tradition of Vishnu and Shiva do, and understand that both of them avatared people, and that Lord Maitreya is going to be an avatar of Shiva. Right?
The
So
destroyer.
it's going to be that symbiotic relationship, and that's the Christ consciousness thing that they're talking about in New Age. So expect that the son of perdition, Apollyon, probably will avatar Antichrist, likely after his fatal head wound, and which will magnify his power. And that's why he's going to honor the god of forces, which is the Hebrew word maz, which is rooted in, you'll like this, Hebrew words az, as, and azaz, which are the prefix letters for Azazel, because you put the el on it with an angel's name to create the name, like Michael or Gabriel or whatever. They all end in el, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's the god of forces, and he's the god that's going to be released, that I think Antichrist is going to honor. Now, also, Satan is also going to give Antichrist great power. So there might be two avatars working within Antichrist to do it, but that's a symbiotic relationship where they invite them in, and the host isn't suppressed. It's working together. I would sort of look for that. Ezekiel 37 is part of the mystery of God. It happens after rapture. It happens as part of second Exodus, because as you move into the teens in Ezekiel 37, that's the joining of the rods. And they're going to be formulated under King David. This is the resurrection that Daniel 12 is talking about in the time of Jacob's trouble. In the last 3.5 years, it says in the time of trouble in Daniel 12, and I think Jeremiah 37 for Jacob's trouble. This is the time that Jesus will lead them in Exodus, as Micah talks about, with their Lord at their head, from around the world with the 7 shepherds to meet up with Judea in the desert. And this is the time that God and Jesus will finish the mystery of God after rapture with Israel and Judah. It is the time afterwards that they are the elect who are going to become also the new elect in time for the bride. It is the time when Judah recognizes the one that they pierced. It is the time when the 144,000 has awakened Israel to be united in the desert, and all Israel will come under the judgment at that time, which is the resurrection of the dry bones of all Israel to go under the judge, and having accepted Jesus as being their Messiah and the Redeemer and the Word of God, will be part of the bride that's talked about in Revelations.
The gathering of the elect and the wheat and the first fruits, all the harvests are finally together. That's good stuff, Gary.
Yeah, I have some documents on that if people want it. I did it quickly, but there's a lot of information that backs that up. So,
well, I'm going to tell you right now, real quick, that this is very exciting for me, because I do a little Bible study. Hold that thought, NPC. I do a little Bible study with my friend Ben's on my channel, and we are so not Bible scholars. So listening to you is awesome, and we love having you, but it's also fun on the other side, everybody, that just a couple of people who are just trying to learn the Bible get together also on this channel and try to understand it and read it at a very, newish kind of level. And this is what's so cool, is we have this area of awesome expertise down to just me and a guy who wants to read Daniel together live when people want to get together and do that and not have such a depth of knowledge. But this is how we get there, is we start just by reading the scriptures and then talking to people like you and getting to understand these things. So I just wanted to mention that it could make a person feel like kind of, it's kind of humbling, but at the same time I love that I'm still trying and still going there and learning.
Yeah. Well, and for the people that, in the chat room that are just, learning, don't worry about where you are. It will come. And I know it's very, very confusing for people when they hear so many different views and different timetables and this and that. And for me, it didn't sort of come together until I learned a few basic things. And then I could put things together in a way that made some sense. So if you're just starting out, then here's what I would advise is first understand that the Bible is very linear. It starts in Genesis, it ends at the end of Revelations. Revelations is linear as well. So if you get the book of the prophets that are inserted, they have markers and references as to where they fit in the chronology of the Old Testament. Just as Revelations, you have events happening after Revelation 14 that seem to be moving sort of back and forth, but it is still linear. At the end of Revelation 14, you get a summary of the last 3.5 years. What you get after between 15 and 19 is the details of that, and then you move on into the millennium. You have the birth pangs that are linear, and they get to 25%, and then they get to 33%, and then the last 3.5 years they'd get to 100%, except Jesus steps in. So understand the Bible is linear. I look at the Bible from a literal understanding, and all allegory is defined within the Bible, not outside the Bible, all within the Bible. And so I have a literal application. I don't believe you can leave out any inconvenient passages.
Yeah, exactly.
So many people have a preconceived idea of how they think it should finish, right. And any passage that doesn't fit, they just ignore.
Yep.
And people get kind of fooled and deceived that way. You have to be able to insert every verse and make sure there's no contradiction. And if you're doing it in the way that what I'm suggesting, you'll find that there are no contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
But there's two other things you need to do as well. You have to apply all prophecies to Israel, and Jacob as being Israel as well. And all prophecies to Judah as to Judah, not to the church, and don't confuse any of the three. Because if you do, you're going to get confused. And so if you've got a prophecy for Manasseh or Ephraim, even though they're part of Israel, that's for a couple specific tribes for the end time. So that's a different part, but you'll find that that all fits in. But here's the most important thing that you need to do, in my opinion. And nobody needs to take my advice, but you can test everything I do based on these rules. And it allowed me to continue to develop in an organized way chronologies. What I do is I put everything around what Jesus said first, not vice versa. Jesus gives you the end time chronology and prophecy. He gives you the authority. Yeah, Matthew 24, with clear markers of trumpets and the abomination and how things happen. And it's worded, and then at that time. I mean, it's a chronological, it's not arranged in topics. It's arranged chronologically that fits perfectly with Revelation. If you look at it that
it's
way.
The revelation of Jesus Christ. That's the we kind of abbreviated a lot.
Yeah, so you don't have to do any apologies in terms of 2 Thessalonians or ignore that or wash away Revelation in 1,000 different ways because it doesn't make sense to it. It all starts to fall in place. Jesus is the authority. He is the spirit of prophecy. He is the word of God. So if you use those simple rules, you can add to where you are and things will fit. But don't force feed it. I mean, you've got 7 years at the end. You know what those 7 years are. Don't let people say there isn't, those aren't the last 7 years. The end, as you take that back in Daniel 9:26, is translated as the end of time, the last days, the last 7 years. I mean, it's self-explanatory if you let it. But people will do all sorts of things to say that there is no last 7 years, that the abomination has already happened. But that's only because they can only get away with that if you let them ignore the inconvenient passages.
Are you referring to like preterism, for instance?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's dangerous, personally. I also wanted to ask another question, if that's okay, but I don't want to interrupt if you had something, Aaron.
I know, because we're about on the 2-hour mark. So if you ask why don't you ask your last question, then we'll close out in prayer.
So again with the covenant, I just wanted to ask again. So we see this character in Revelation, since we're mentioning Revelation, the character with the bow. Does this bow represent a covenant then also, you think?
Yeah, bow and crown are two interesting words there, and it's one of the things I didn't throw in is what I do is I like to take everything back to Greek and Hebrew because you get a fuller understanding. Now you have multiple meanings for a lot of words in each, so you select the right meaning that doesn't contradict in the narrative that it's in.
Yeah,
or
like
the rest of Scripture.
Stephanos.
Yeah. So when you look at bow and crown, you have bow, which is some sort of cloth or robe, not a weapon bow.
Oh.
And crown is a crown that would be like an ancient kind of crown, of sheaves. Like the logo that is on the UN symbol, or the crown that they would put on Olympic athletes for winning, or the crown that would be worn by a Roman or a Greek god or emperor or king. And so it's a different type of crown than what people think. It's not about war. It's about, assembling that new world order, right? And so this is like the crown that I'm trying to think of the Greek goddess's name that escaped.
Nike.
No, that escaped from Apollo and
Laurel. The laurel tree, yeah.
Yes, and that is the same root word for Lorraine, and the
France.
Yeah, and you have the double cross of Lorraine. That's another rabbit hole. But my point of the matter is, this is that crown and the laurel tree grows a lot in the Lorraine region of France, by the way.
There's also a shrine of Apollo there.
Yeah. So where I'm going with this is that, and just to make it sort of short, is I think that is about the coming together of the world under one sort of a religion and one sort of leader, although Antichrist isn't crowned to the midpoint, but it's not uniting the world through war. But there is wars that are going to bring the world together, right? It's part of the birth pangs. So you've got that happening just before the start of the last 7 years, but it's setting up for the signing of the covenant. And you have those 4 horses that are going out, and those 4 horses are the same catastrophes that are in the birth pangs, right? So they are going out throughout the earth. And that's the time of the rise of Babylon.
It's also false prophets. It's also interesting that you mentioned it was a cloth bow, because angels, I've often seen angels depicted either with swords or a ribbon that they would use to bind with. And you think, oh, what can you do with a ribbon? Well, if they bound you with that, you're not getting it off.
I cover that off in a commentary I do, and I think it's a 3-part series on the 4 horsemen, where I explain what the bow is as you take that back to Greek, and then bring in all of those other sort of references that I'm talking about to give people an understanding. And we need to understand that these riders, and that's the first rider, that is not like a human, right? They come from before the throne. Right?
Yeah, they're fruit inspectors.
Yeah, and the rider is called him or he. And in Greek, that's the word autos, which is a reflective pronoun and or a baffling wind. What's interesting about that, not only do they come from the throne, but you have in Zechariah the 4 chariots, which are basically the same colors. They also come from before the throne, and they go out through the earth, and those are spirits. What I'm telling you is these are the 4 winds. These are the 4 spirits of prophecy and empires, and they're going out. And I explain this in that 3-part series. They are bringing about the last empire. They bring So when you've got Daniel, I think it's in Daniel 7 and 8 where it mentions the four winds.
Yeah, and the goat with the horn that breaks, and then the
Yeah.
four come from it.
Yeah, and the four beast empires. They're bringing up the empires from the sea. They're going to bring up the empire of the sea in the end time again. You have the four winds that are taking place in Ezekiel 37 that you were talking about. These are the four winds that come from before the throne that are the four winds of prophecy and empires. They are specific beings. These aren't these evil things that they're predicted to be because they come from the throne.
So they're basically like principalities almost then, huh? In a
Yeah,
sense.
I'm not sure what classification they actually are, but they're from around the throne, and they certainly have a special place. I've not been able to trace because there are several ones. There's powers, for example,
Yeah.
and typically though, principalities comes from the word arca. For archon, and typically those ones are more for a military type positioning. Okay, that's where the archons would come from as well. So, but they're also for government as well. You can get arca with the principalities as well. But principalities it comes out of two different words at times in the New Testament. So depending on which one that you're using, just as powers comes from exousia and dunamis. So again, you have to know which one it's actually referring to when you're using the term. So, but typically principalities come from arca. So could be part of the archangels, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and several of those were including Azazel. I believe he was a high-ranking one too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Okay.
sharing.
Well, you guess what, you guys? In 2 weeks, we have Gary coming back, and we're going to talk about fairies and gnomes, and maybe even a little Bigfoot or whatever. That kind of there's a lot in that. I've already listened to Gary talk on the world of Bigfoot. I'm going to say it wrong. He's on here. He's been in here. World Bigfoot Radio. Sorry. Anyway, he's been here tonight, which I appreciate. I've been watching you talk about that, and I saw it, and I was like, that's got to be the next topic with Gary. So that's in 2 weeks. And the reason I invite NPC is because he is a better. Well, we're all good at something, but he's very good at coming up with good questions. So we're all three going to be here again in 2 weeks.
So yeah, we're going to talk about that. Then what I'll do also, just to give a bit of a preview, is I'll connect that to the hierarchy of angels.
Oh, good.
And the connection to the lower level of the organizational realm where the fairies and that might be part of.
Okay.
And where that shows up in the Bible.
Okay, I'm excited about that because I was having a really good time listening. I'm like, oh, I want that to be the next topic. But so I won't ask anyone to pray. If you guys don't mind, I'll just go ahead and pray and close it out tonight. How's that sound?
Sure.
All right. Lord Jesus, thank you for brilliant minds. Thank you for topics of discussion that are fun and interesting and amazing. And while it's not usually salvational, it can help just create a stronger faith and a greater understanding of who you really are, Jesus. And for me, it's done that. And I am so grateful for both of these two men, Gary Wayne and NPC, and all the people that come and listen in the chat and all the people that would be listening later. Lord, I pray that you would speak to them through us, that we are just conduits of your word, and that they would understand you more because of what they heard tonight. While there's always differing opinions, Lord Jesus, we just want to give you all the glory. All the glory goes to you in all that we're doing here. And we hope that souls would come to you, and there's still souls to be saved, and maybe reach some of those with more questions for salvation and bring them there to you, Jesus. And we pray to work just as hard as those that work against us into stealing souls. Let us bring more souls to you and protect the remnant while we are at it. Thank you, Jesus. In your holy, mighty name we pray. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach of Nazareth. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you again. We're going to see you in 2 short weeks, so
Yeah.
I'll let you go for the night and have a blessed night, NPC. Thanks for being here yourself, and
Yep.
Gary,
No
see you
problem.
in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, and hopefully the chat room liked what we were talking about tonight. And
I think so.
Don't be afraid to shoot me an email. I'm now catching up on my backlog of being away from some of my personal things that have happened in my life, and so I'm catching up on things. So don't be afraid to get a hold of me.
Yes. And you can also get a hold of me. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, and have a blessed night, everybody.
Thank you all for your time. Oh, it's Feast of Tabernacles begins.
That's right. Feast of
tonight,
Tabernacles.
by the way. So you go camping and think about Joshua conquering all those giants.
Yeah.
Farewell, folks.
Go camping tonight. All right. Good night, guys.
Good night.
Moment of time, and this is the day and the age. We are the branch of the vine, and these are the fruit of his ways. We have been given these signs, approaching the end of the day. Seeking his word, read every verse, praying it's not in your face. Pray that he gives you a taste, pray that he